Belfast, 1980s. A man sits by a café window, one coffee in front of him, going cold. Trainees learn to sit like this for 9 hours. The goal, according to one account, was to look like a man waiting for a friend who never turns up. He is a candidate moving through selection for 14 intelligence company, the Det, a unit whose reported admission numbers have followed it for decades. A published account says 1,000 people entered the pipeline. Only 17 succeeded. Before that number travels any further, it needs a label, reported. The publication behind it's unidentified in the available record. No Ministry of Defence document confirms it. No archival file backs it. The National Archive's own research guide on British intelligence services states that many files, especially those relating to living individuals or covering sensitive material, have been destroyed or retained by the security services themselves and haven't been accessioned by the National Archives. That is the archival reality the Det's story lives inside. What exists instead is a Wikipedia entry on the unit's successor formation, traceable to 2012, which states that in one selection course, out of 1,000 applicants, only 17 were ultimately deployed to Northern Ireland. A children's encyclopedia called Kiddle, which rewrites Wikipedia for school children, repeats the number as a simplified example of toughness. For example, in one selection course, 1,000 people applied, but only 17 were chosen to go to Northern Ireland. A 4-minute video explainer features a self-identified former operator, recalling that out of 1,000 applicants at the start, 17 actually went to Northern Ireland. An Instagram post offers the same ratio, truncated mid-sentence. The wording of the two published versions matters. Both say, in one selection course. The ratio describes a single course, not an official acceptance rate, and the word used is applied, not entered the pipeline. The number may count people who never physically started. One competing figure muddies the water further. A social media post claims fewer than 400 operators passed selection in the unit's entire history. A different scale entirely, in a caption that cuts off mid-sentence. For contrast, the Intelligence Corps, a related but distinct branch, publicly cites typical pass rates of around 50 to 60% for its own selection. The Det's reported ratio isn't a standard British intelligence figure. It's an outlier so extreme that it has acquired the texture of legend, which makes the provenance detail the most deflating one available. The best-known statistic attached to the Det lives, in traceable form, on a page written for schoolchildren. That is the state of the evidence. What survives in better shape is the character of the selection itself. Across books, unit histories, and veteran recollections, the same profile keeps emerging, and it inverts the usual Special Forces story. The quality that mattered most wasn't looking elite. It was being completely forgettable. 14 Intelligence Company was established in 1973, deep in the Troubles, for a single purpose: plainclothes surveillance in Northern Ireland. Operators followed suspects on foot and in cars. They watched houses from parked vehicles and from hedgerows. They photographed, logged, and reported, and if they were noticed, the mission had failed before it began. The unit drew volunteers from across the British Armed Forces, and both men and women could serve. That made it one of the first UK special purpose units to include women, a fact that later became the subject of its own documentary account, She Who Dared. Selection and training were developed by a training wing of 22 SAS, drawing on methods inherited from the wartime Special Operations Executive. The Det was built for a different problem than the SAS, and the profile it selected for reflected that. James Rennie's 1996 book, The Operators, a first-person account now catalogued by the Imperial War Museums, carries a publisher's description that calls the selection the most physically, intellectually, and emotionally demanding anywhere in the world. Bold words. The demands beneath them aren't what that phrase usually conjures. If the sources agree on anything, it's a cluster of 6 qualities: observe, remember, endure, communicate, drive, disappear. No document calls this a 6-part list. The accounts describe it in pieces across different authors and different decades. Sources even disagree on how long selection lasted. Grey Dynamics describes a 2-week course. Sofrep describes an 8-week Camp 1. A French language account compresses the entire pipeline into 6 months. The exact timeline remains unresolved. But piece by piece, the same shape appears. Grey Dynamics describes the initial assessment as a 1-day program. Physical training, an interview, and IQ tests, before the real filtering began. What followed was designed, in that source's word, to whittle down the candidate numbers. The first demand was observation, the capacity to collect information by watching without being noticed. The reference site Elite UK Forces states it plainly. Excellent observational abilities, stamina, and the ability to think under stress are vital for undercover surveillance work. The ARRSE Wiki, a long-running reference for British military law, describes the unit's core discipline as the ability to observe, follow, and communicate covertly. 3 verbs that cover the entire job. Observation came first because everything else depended on it. The defense analysis site Grey Dynamics lists intellectual tasks and memory retention exercises among the selection techniques, delivered immediately after exhausting physical training. The ordering is the mechanism. A Det operator had to think clearly while physically spent, because that is precisely what the job demanded. The operations this selection fed into explain why. Operators followed suspects through hostile areas for extended periods. They occupied static observation posts for hours at a time, photographing who came and went, logging every detail. One documented operation, November 1982, Slieve Gullion, County Armagh, ran 11 days with 4 operators watching from a position in a hedgerow. Watching was the mission. Everything else existed to support it. A frequently quoted recruiting appeal reportedly invited volunteers for special duties of a hazardous nature in Northern Ireland, wording that promised danger and revealed nothing about the actual work. The primary archival source for that notice hasn't been located. Like much of the Det's paper trail, it survives only in retelling. Observation without memory is useless. The second demand was recall, the capacity to store what you had seen and retrieve it later under stress. Grey Dynamics lists memory retention exercises among the techniques used to reduce candidate numbers during selection. One video account, unverified, though consistent with the others, describes candidates observing a scene for roughly 2 minutes, then recalling its details an hour later, after physical exertion. The operational version of this appears in Sofrep's multi-part history of the unit. It describes newly arrived operators being driven around their patch by seasoned colleagues, learning who the major players were and which pubs were off-limits, then compiling long cheat sheets of suspects' names, car registration numbers, homes, stores, and pubs. The Det needed people who noticed things. It also needed people who could carry those details in their heads under pressure and put them on paper later with every digit correct. No source provides exact scoring for any of this. No pass mark, no time limit, no failure tally. The accounts describe the mechanism, not the measurements. That distinction runs through everything the debt selection is said to have involved. The third demand was endurance, specifically performance under sleep deprivation, not suffering for its own sake. The question was whether a candidate could still observe, remember, and think coherently when exhausted and disoriented. Grey Dynamics describes selection built on sleep deprivation, erratic schedules, and even depriving candidates of knowledge of the time. Candidates were reportedly left unsure what time it was or what would happen next. Intellectual tasks followed exhausting physical sessions, testing whether the brain still worked when the body was failing. The operational logic is direct. Debt missions involved multi-day static surveillance from safe houses and parked cars. Operators managed human waste in sealed containers so they wouldn't have to break position. They rotated sleep so one operator was always watching the target through optics, logging every vehicle, registration number, time, duration, description of the occupants. On the third night of a job like that, an operator who couldn't function wasn't merely tired. They were a failed asset. Some accounts contrast this approach with SAS Selection's punishing hill phase on the Brecon Beacons. The debt, in that telling, wanted a different and complementary profile. The mountain marathon runner wasn't the model. The operator who could still think straight on day 3 of a surveillance was. The fourth demand was communication, covert communication. And here the record needs a correction. What the sources document clearly is that debt operators were trained in surveillance disciplines that included talking over a radio network without giving themselves away. They used encrypted radios with concealed earpieces and throat microphones, so an operator could speak on the net in public without appearing to say a word. When even that was too exposed, operators clicked over the network, non-verbal signals carrying meaning without language. What the sources don't document is formal selection phase testing of radio procedure, message codes, or dead drops. Those skills appear in the record as training and operational tradecraft, not as documented selection gates. The unit was small and cross-trained. No dedicated radio operator billet appears in the open source record. Every operator had to be able to pass information safely, or the intelligence never reached anyone who could use it. The fifth demand requires the same correction. Advanced driving is documented as a training phase in the debt pipeline, with pass or fail gates, rather than as a standalone demand of initial selection. SOFREP describes a 7-phase, 6-month training program that included a driving phase, with tests at the end of each phase that candidates had to pass to continue. The ARRSE Wiki lists the curriculum: sustained high-speed driving, using vehicles as weapons, controlled crashes, skid recovery, anti-ambush skills. French language coverage of the unit mentions instruction in conduite rapide, fast driving, as part of the same syllabus. None of that was glamorous, and none of it was for show. In Northern Ireland, driving mattered for surveillance, holding a tail on a suspect through city streets without being burned, and for movement, when unobserved arrival and departure were the entire point. Driving was the specialist skill that let an operator move without drawing a single eye, and then leave the same way. And that brings the selection to its strangest and most important demand, the sixth: disappearing. This is where the debt's reported standard inverts every expectation. Most military selection rewards visible toughness. The debt reportedly screened for the opposite. The eligibility requirements are the clearest evidence. Grey Dynamics lists no identifiable markings such as tattoos, birthmarks or scars as a condition of candidacy. SOFREP is blunter. Candidates with unique features, such as scars, birthmarks, or excessive tattoos, were declined outright. Being unmarried was an advantage. Looking unmilitary was an advantage. One video account gives the reasoning directly. Identifiable markings would make an operator memorable if compromised. The modern tactical term for this is grey man. No source in the available record uses that exact phrase about the debt. It may be modern training language applied backwards. The principle is the same, and the operational reasoning is airtight. A surveillance operator working undercover in a hostile community couldn't afford to be distinctive. A tattoo could be remembered. A scar could be described. A military bearing could identify a soldier in a crowd of civilians. One account describes trainees learning to sit in that Belfast café for 9 hours, looking like a man waiting for a friend who never turns up. That image is the debt in miniature: patience, observation, and the complete absence of presence. The inclusion of women reinforces the point. The debt was one of the first UK special purpose units to accept women, an operational decision because the job didn't run on upper body strength. It ran on attention, patience, and memorability in reverse. A male tough guy image didn't match the requirement. In some contexts, it was a liability. A surveillance team needed bodies that could pass in any setting, and a lone man wasn't always the right one. The contrast between expectation and reality runs through the whole selection. Most people approaching a special forces course expect to be tested on how much they can take. The debt's reported standard tested something else: what they could notice and how little they themselves could be noticed. None of this means the work required no nerve. Following a suspect through a hostile estate took a specific kind of courage, and the accounts make clear the operators possessed it. But the documented standard pointed away from visible toughness. The selectors reportedly wanted operatives who could pass through a crowd, leaving no trace. There is an obvious objection to all of this. Everything about elite units gets framed in terms of bravery. Surely the debt was looking for brave people above all. One commenter, in a thread about the unit, offers a useful complication. He says senior NCOs invited him to join 14 INT in the 1990s. He declined because he was, in his own words, not brave enough. The claim received 12 likes. It's a personal recollection, not proof, not policy, and no external source corroborates it. But it matters because it captures a perception that even a formally invited candidate carried into the decision: the conviction that courage was the barrier. The published descriptions point elsewhere. The qualities that recur across grey dynamics, elite UK forces and SOFREP are intelligence, initiative, independent thinking, mental stamina, observational skill, self-reliance. Courage isn't the most prominent item on any of those lists. The descriptions return again and again to quieter disciplines: watching, remembering, and staying invisible while doing both. The invitation itself is worth a moment. If that recollection is accurate, the debt wasn't only accepting volunteers. It was actively identifying people worth approaching. Selection in that model began before the candidate ever arrived. One more piece of comment-level lore deserves a passing mention: recollections about tattoos affecting debt applications. The documented rule is clear: no identifiable markings. The comment-level stories can't be verified. Their complete wording and engagement counts are unavailable, and individual anecdotes can't establish a universal policy. They remain what they are: lore. And lore is exactly the difficulty this story keeps running into. The conversation around the debt, in comment sections, in video recollections, in the circulation of the 17 from 1,000 figure itself, is where reported numbers harden into accepted fact. The pattern shows up in the comment threads attached to debt videos and articles. One close reading of a single thread produces 50 substantive comments. Other counts of the same conversation run to 346, and another to 430. Within the first batch of 50, corrections and law additions drew 311 engagements from just 16 comments. The unverifiable material was, by engagement, the most magnetic part of the conversation. Those conflicting counts are the point. Every layer of the debt story carries the same uncertainty. The reported statistic, the personal recollection, the video account, the story that came from a friend of a friend. Knowing which layer you are reading is the difference between history and myth. So what did it take to join the debt? On the evidence available, the reported standard wasn't simply courage. It was the ability to observe, to watch a street for 9 hours and miss nothing, to remember, to hold a face, a registration plate, a pattern of comings and goings in your head until the moment it mattered, to endure, to think clearly on the third sleepless night of a static observation post, to communicate, to pass on what you had seen without ever revealing you had seen it, to drive, to move, follow, and escape without drawing attention, and then to disappear, to be so unremarkable that the man in the cafe window, the man on the street corner, the man behind the wheel couldn't be described, remembered, or picked out of a line an hour later. The unit's functions were eventually folded into the Special Reconnaissance Regiment. By 2007, a U.S. Joint Special Operations University report could note that the FRU and 14 intelligence company names and groupings have evolved, and that the SRR was widely reported to incorporate heirs to the former 14 intelligence company. The operators aged out, dispersed, and, in keeping with the trade, mostly went unnoticed. The record they left behind is thinner than it should be, and full of figures that refuse to verify themselves. A unit built to be forgettable left a story that resists easy remembering. That is the trade, working exactly as intended. If you have first-hand, family, or second-hand knowledge of the debt, or of a selection like it, tell us which kind of recollection it's. That label matters more than the story itself. It's the difference between reporting and remembering. And it's the final test this subject offers. Hold a detail, carry it, and pass it on without losing the truth in the telling.